Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. This is Rosh, and welcome to AxeFX 3 Basics. So a little about me. I am an LA-based guitar player and guitar tech. Some of my clients include Melissa Etheridge, Steve Vai, Dweezil Zappa, Bush, Perfect Circle, and more. So I wanted to give back to the Fractal community and show some of my approaches on how to build presets. So this topic came up on the forum, and I wanted to kind of address it. So let's talk about boost pedals. So and how to boost the input of an amp. So in this preset, I made two scenes, and they're going to use two different amp types. So in the first scene, we're going to use the USA Clean, which is again a pretty neutral clean sound. And the thing that I want you to take away from this clean sound is that it doesn't distort if I, strum hard. Right? Here's a bridge pickup. So it definitely doesn't compress or distort too much when I play clean. Now in the second scene, I have a deluxe reverb, and this is actually quite the opposite. So this is an amp that if I dig in hard, it'll distort, but if I pick lightly, it'll remain clean. So this is definitely the type of amp that people always talk about maybe being quote-unquote touch sensitive. So basically it just means that it responds to the dynamics of how you pick. So this is definitely a preference of some guitar players, and the USA Clean style amp is the preference of others, where they want a completely undistorted clean sound, and then they use pedals in the front of it to get different types of distortion or overdrive sounds. So it's really important to make a distinction between these two amp types, because how you boost the front end of the amp is going to be totally different, and your approach is going to change depending on the type of amp you're using. So so let's start with like a boost pedal, and in the future I'll cover an overdrive kind of sound, and because the approaches also are different depending if you're using a full clean sound or let's say a quote-unquote clean sound, that kind of edge of breakup kind of clean sound. And there's always a lot of debate of what a clean sound is. I hear people saying Stevie Ray Vaughan plays clean. I hear Nile Rodgers is a clean sound, Prince, so it's really subjective of what a clean sound is. But in the purpose of this video and this tutorial, we'll just talk about something that breaks up and distorts when you strum hard versus the other way. So here's an overdrive into the front, and let's use Fet Boost. Okay, so there are two approaches to boosting the front of the amp. So when you're using a boost pedal, I always actually mess with the level first, but again, you have to keep the distinction between what type of amp you're playing into. So for example, here is the Fet Boost with the drive all the way off, and then if I turn the level up, okay, and then let's slowly add the drive. So again, it's like a clean boost style pedal. And so it's not going to add, as you add drive, it's not really adding quote unquote drive as much as it's adding more input, like input volume into the front of the amp. So you can almost simulate the same thing as a clean boost as taking, for example, a, let's do, we'll do like a parametric EQ or something. Let me just do a graphic EQ so it's easier to see. You could take a neutral graphic EQ, actually just crank the level and going into the front of the amp. However, if you go into the front of, let's say, an amp that distorts, this is going to be pure 20 dB input. It's going to get that amp to distort. So this is kind of what you want to visualize in your head when you're dealing with boost pedals. You're not really adding overdrive, you're just getting the amp to overdrive. So we'll cover that in a second, but if you use this graphic EQ in the front of an amp that doesn't distort, it just gets really loud. if I dig in a little harder, it's going to start clipping, but it's already clipping the input of my interface. So, but you hear that even with 20 dB boost, the amp isn't really breaking up that much. But when I go into the deluxe reverb, it has a certain amount of headroom before it starts distorting. And then when you add this boost in front of it, it's just getting the amp to distort. You notice that it's also not getting that much louder. So this is a really important approach and thing to think about when you are boosting the input of an amp. So here we have the Fet Boost again into the input of this USA Clean, and remember the USA Clean's not distorting, it just gets louder and louder as we generate more input into the amp. So boost pedals aren't really quote-unquote distortion pedals or overdrive pedals, they just get the amp to overdrive. But it's really, really contingent on the amp that you're using. So as I increase this drive, you're just going to notice that the amp just gets louder. So at that point, it's already clipping, and it's not really adding any type of distortion. Now, if we do the same method on the deluxe reverb, and we have the level of 10, and I slowly bring the drive up, you're going to notice that there is a certain point where the amp just does not get any louder, and then it just starts distorting instead. A lot of people confuse this with thinking that the drive knob is adding distortion or gain to the signal. It is not. It is just adding input into the front of the amp. So for example, so right around the 5 to 6 mark, you'll notice that the amp is just getting more distorted, not louder. Now keep in mind, this drive knob is not adding distortion to the amp, it is causing the amp to distort. So that's one distinction you definitely want to keep in mind. It would be the same thing as this graphic EQ block, which is just pure clean volume. You can use a volume block, you can use any of the blocks here that don't actually change the tone of the guitar, they just add more volume. I just wanted to use a graphic EQ to just kind of demonstrate. So if I turn this on and start adding more level, you'll just notice that at some threshold the amp starts distorting or starts getting louder, and then we're only adding more distortion to the amp. But really the amp is just distorting more. And you'll notice that the tones are very similar when we're just cranking into this amp. So that should be an indication that really what we're just getting the amp to do is to distort, because we're just generating so much volume and signal into the input stage of the amp that it's causing the amp to grind. So other boost pedals, such as like let's say the treble boost, it's almost like, if you're thinking of this graphic EQ, it's almost just like the top end of a clean sound boosting into the front of the amp. So if we start at 0, you'll notice that that's just adding a lot more treble signal into the amp and getting it to distort. Now, if we go back to our clean sound, the one that doesn't distort, you'll notice that it's just going to get louder, but in that frequency. So for example, so you already notice that the pedal or the guitar tone is really bright and shrill right now. And it's just going to add more of that. Ouch. So that is, as you notice, that we can just increase this drive knob and it's not going to get this amp to distort. It's just adding that shrill treble into the amp. So again, this amp doesn't break up, doesn't distort, but you could also do the same thing into the distortion portion of, or I'm sorry, into the amp that's going to break up, and you'll get definitely like a cleaner kind of sound to get this amp to overdrive a little bit. But since you're pulling the low end, it's not going to be as woofy in the low end because if you're using a treble boost. So for example, as opposed to this graphic EQ. See how it's keeping that low end. So you can almost visualize it as the treble boost. This is doing something similar to this. And I'm just kind of just ballparking this. Ooh, that's not that great, but hopefully you get the idea. So these boost pedals are kind of based off of some of the popular versions or the popular boost and overdrive pedals that you're used to. So hopefully that kind of clears up a little bit of what a boost pedal actually does. So keep in mind, here's the main takeaway. If you're using an amp that doesn't distort and you're using a boost pedal into it, it's just going to make the amp go louder. Think of these almost as just like a volume push into the front of the amp with a little bit of EQ. And depending on the type of boost pedal, like Fet Boost or mid boost, this is boosting the mids, this is boosting the treble. This is based off of like, you know, like I think it's a solid state. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. And then some of these other preamp ones, they're just kind of like, again, pushing the front end of the amp. Now, if the amp doesn't overdrive as it gets louder, then it's just going to keep getting louder. But if you have an amp that does overdrive as it gets louder, then these boost pedals are great for getting the amp to distort. Now keep in mind that as you add drive, you're not adding distortion from the pedal, you're just getting the amp to distort more. That's the main distinction that you really want to keep in mind. And the cool thing about boost pedals is like they really, really make your guitar very interactive with the amp. They're very sensitive to using the volume knob on your guitar, so you can get a whole variety of tones. So if we go back to this Fet Boost, everything's like cranked. So I'm like consistently rolling the volume a little bit lower each time, and I'm getting a wide variety of tones. As opposed to if I was just without the pedal. You notice right away that as I roll the volume off, I'm getting also a volume drop off. This helps the volume stay consistent, but gives you a wide variety of tones. So it's a lot of versatility that you can use a boost pedal for. All right, so if you have any questions, by all means, feel free to reach out, and I will be making more videos in the near future. Thanks.